It says here that I'm supposed to introduce you all, but I think it'd be much better if everyone heard from you rather than me reading off this piece of paper. So do you want to start?
Sure. I'm Tammy Augustine. I'm a clinical faculty member in teaching and learning, and I work with our pre-service teachers.
So I am Jasmine Roberts. I'm a lecturer in the School of Communication. I specifically teach classes related to public relations, and then outside of this teaching thing that I do, I'm very passionate about the notion of open education.
I'm Ethan Zuckerman from MIT. You've already heard far too much from me, so I'll do my best to be quiet.
And I'm Christian McGee. I attended Ohio State, just recently graduated, so I was a student. And I'm also president of GROW, Getting Ready for Opportunities and Work, a nonprofit organization. And as a result of the President's Prize, I was one of the 2 recipients, so I'll be able to dedicate my life towards that. So, yeah.
So welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you for participating this morning in our panel discussion. So I have a couple questions to get us started, and then we're going to go to the Twitterverse to get more questions from all of you. So we talk a lot about preparing students for the real world, and in quotes, right? Because I think what we do here is the real world. What does this mean to you as an educator? What is or a student, or from the seat that you sit in? We don't have to go in any specific order. We don't have to go up and down. We don't all have to answer a question either. There are no rules in this panel. But Tammy, why don't you start?
For me, it's connecting experiences that take place in the classroom, in the 4 walls of the classroom, to what students are experiencing in their day-to-day lives. So real world, in quotes, works well for me because our students are experiencing the real world every day. The challenges that young people face today, they need classrooms to be able to help them face those challenges. We also want to prepare them for the future. And so looking at what challenges might they face, the pace of change makes that a little difficult. So what we want to try to do is give them the skills to always be able to address these problems, be problem solvers and innovative thinkers.
Please. Yeah.
Well, I will say I'm really glad that we're having this conversation about real-world application. Because I do feel like we're coming at a reckoning point in higher ed. I think it was a Pew Research survey that found that 6 out of 10 Americans think that higher education institutions are going in the wrong direction. And as an educator, that makes me very nervous. And the 2 top reasons why that's the case from those particular individuals who stated that was because of tuition costs, and those who believe that we're not preparing our students enough for some of those real-world conditions. And those students, or our students, are making those same value judgments. And to be honest with you, I don't blame them. And I think there are a lot of instructors, at least here at Ohio State, and I'm sure at other universities, who are thinking about this question of real-world application and how I can make my classrooms more indicative of those real-world conditions, but we need more support maybe and guidance. We're so focused on providing our students with a liberal arts education to where we're kind of like, okay, where's that sweet spot between real-world application and a liberal arts education as well? For me, it means having a critical conversation about grades with my students. We have trained our students to focus so much on those grades to where like they lose the magic out of the learning process. I was just listening to Oprah. You know, she's just amazing. And she had Dr., I think her name is Shalafi Sabari, who talks about conscious parenting. And she discussed how she did not allow her daughter to see her report card until the 5th grade. The 5th grade. Can you guys imagine that? And I just thought that was a very interesting perspective in terms of how she has taught her daughter to approach the grade process. And so what I try to do with my students is focus more so on the skills application. And I literally look at job postings that my students might want to be interested in after they graduate from Ohio State and think to myself, okay, how can I make sure that I'm hitting those skill sets in my own respective classroom? And it's also having a conversation about expectations, that sometimes hard work does not yield the results that you want wanted to. That's a tough life lesson. You know, a lot of students think that because they work really hard, they deserve that A, and you know, that can be kind of, again, a tough conversation to have. I'm sure many of you in the audience today have probably worked really hard on a paper or on a research grant proposal only for it to get rejected. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't a lesson in that, right? So what I also try to do is have a conversation with my students about having a growth mindset, that, you know, within failure there is growth, there is a learning experience, that talent and intelligence, they're not fixed qualities, right? That we can constantly work at those attributes.
So I teach the humanities at an engineering school, and you've got to imagine I get a lot of questions about, are there any real-world implications to this? And let me just say, it's even more than that. If you show up as an undergrad at MIT, you're required to do a year of physics, year of mathematics, semester of chem, semester of biology, 8 semesters of humanities. And the students hate it. And they sort of say, well, wait a second, I came to an engineering school. Why do I have to do this? And honestly, we finally, in the last year or so, been having a little traction because people have been saying, oh, Facebook might be destroying democracy. I wonder whether the humanities might have something to tell us about that. And, you know, we've been saying for years that, you know, the humanities are useful because the sciences will tell you how to take the blood of a dinosaur out of a mosquito trapped in amber and bring it back to life. And the humanities might tell you why that's a bad idea. But now we're starting to have these very real conversations for people who are building tools that help us interact in the digital world. Questions about what's a healthy conversation? Is it okay for us just to hear from like-minded voices? Do we need some diversity in there? Is it okay just to hear about the news of the world? What happens if we end up sort of feeling like we're on the sidelines, like we're feeling helpless? These are all questions that come out in the humanities. And sometimes we teach them in a way where we make them feel ancient, part of history. I'm finding that if I can tie things to debates that are happening in real time that people are fascinated by, and debates that my students know that they're going to walk into. My students know that if they're building artificial intelligence, they're building machine learning systems, someone at some point is going to talk to them about discrimination. And probably the highest profile project in my lab right now is work being done by my PhD student, Joy Bolamwini, who's been able to demonstrate that many types of facial recognition AI work far better on white men than they do on black women. And that there are intersectional biases that are sort of built into these systems. She is a computer engineer who, in the process of doing this, has had to do all of this work on gender studies, on African American studies, on ways in which bias gets sort of built up. So I think if you can find those contemporary debates, if you can help people connect to what they're seeing in the world every day and bring it into what you're doing, I think it does a really great job of sort of making these lessons land.
Yeah, what they have all said is very true. I've really viewed having a real-world experience in the school, in the classroom, is going beyond the 4 walls. It's being able to take topics and what's going on in the world and bring it into the classroom. And even going out yourself and exploring. And looking at the experiences that I have had, it's something that really stands out to me is that there's been a lot of tangible experiences that has forced me to grow, where the foundation was taken from under me, where you're no longer safe, like you're safe to fail, but failure is a risk. It's something that you're not sure that you're going to be successful at. That the guidelines aren't written out. There's there's ambiguity. And a firm example of that was this instance of a case competition where my team and I were working together on this thing called Alma Brand, and it was a social enterprise out in Brazil. They didn't really articulate how we could really go about the situation of how to improve their product or brand. They just said, here, fix it, address it. And we had to work with students in Brazil in order to get this end goal. And the thing that was amazing was we were so uncertain, we had to figure out how to work with students from another place, figure out the timing of everything, create the communication structure where their first language was in English. And lo and behold, you start going through all these hoops and things that you've never really explored before, and really implementing innovative strategies and exercises for students to embark on that they have never seen before is so realistic and ties to the real world in so many different ways. And reflecting back on that, I'm like, wow, it actually prepared me and equipped me for things that I never imagined before. And really just, yeah. Yeah.
No, that's great. Thank you. Thank you all for those opinions. So I failed in my first task as moderator. If you have a question, you could tweet it to Innovate Explore. but some of you have figured that out. So the questions that are coming in and on, again, as interactive as we can be. So please think of your questions and send them in to add to this conversation. One of the challenges I think we all face is what's the role of the instructor of bringing these real world examples in. And, I have this conversation a lot with faculty. Well, I'm here to teach my subject matter, right? And what else do I have to bring in? Because I only have 16 weeks and 3 hours a week, and I have to this and this and this and this. So how do we, or what's our role in giving students this historical perspective? Maybe Ethan, that you talked about earlier this morning, to inform their actions and engagement and change.
So it's funny. I've never taught history formally, but I find that I'm teaching more and more and more of it these days. The class that I just taught, the last class of it yesterday, is a class called News and Participatory Media. And on the last day of class, I asked everybody one takeaway and one improvement for the class. And for half of the people, the takeaway was the history of American journalism and some of this very distant history from the late 1700s, early 1800s, about how we subsidized the post office to basically create an internet made out of print and letters, more than 200 years ago. And what I'm finding is that I use history these days to teach ethics. I basically look at history because we can pick things apart and sort of say, what were people's motivations behind this? What were they considering and what weren't they considering? What were the priorities that they set? Turned out in early America, we put this very heavy priority on letting citizens have a voice, letting them be part of the political dialogue. And we did it because no one had ever tried to run a nation through citizen input before. And so in 1835, 80% of the US government was the post office. We were basically a post office with a small government and a little bitty army attached to it. And it's because we made those value judgments about who we should be as a society. So you can go back at that and sort of say, okay, all right, we're almost 200 years after that. How are we setting our priorities? Is that where we want to put our emphasis? How do we want to think about those things these days? You don't have to necessarily put your finger on the scale. You can look and say, here are historical examples of how we've tried to do it before. So I find that I use history more and more and more, but I'm always trying hard to bring it into the present day. And what I'm finding is that those lessons, those questions, how do we organize ourselves as a society? What do I prioritize? How do I put certain checks in place? Those are questions that we're asking now, and having that historical perspective on it gives people a chance to see how people have solved those problems in the past.
I think as educators, we focus way too much on content. We're in this rat race to push out the content to our students, and then we move on to the next semester, the next group of students. And I think we need to pause, take a breath, and think to ourselves, what kind of student do I want to leave my classroom at the end of this semester? How can I help that student cultivate and get more in touch with their inner being through my subject matter, right? So it's not so much, these students are knowledge buckets. I don't know, it just grinds my gears when educators approach students that way. They're not knowledge buckets. They are fundamental contributors to the learning process. So I think we need to start there first before I actually answer your question. So, yeah.
Just kind of off what she was sharing, it kind of brought something to mind. Is I think that something that's very important is the choice architecture that is given to students, really empowering them to be independent. And one of the most memorable things for me was in one of my classes, the professor was like, hey, you guys are supposed to be doing a presentation, but what about you guys do a video presentation and create a marketing commercial instead, rather than standing up and just presenting? Because during that semester, we had 5 other presentations going on. So what she did, she gave us a top hat, and we did a poll if that was what we wanted to do. And that's what we opted for. And actually, we had so much fun, and we were so much more engaged because we had a choice in how we were learning. And giving us the autonomy and empowering us to do so will infuse just a greater learning experience for many students. And I think is so important.
I was a social studies teacher, so the focus on history is something that resonates a lot with me. So for one of the things I do in my classes is there are underground railroad markers here on the OSU's campus. My students, my graduate students who have been here for 5 years have no idea that those exist. So we go and we take a walking tour. We get out of the classroom, we take a walking tour of those markers. We then work out from there. What was the role of the black codes in Columbus, and we look at the history of that. We go down to Cincinnati to the National Freedom Center, which brings it right back to current day to look at 21st century slavery and human trafficking, which brings us back to the local. And then the students decide, what do I want to do with this? And they create education campaigns. It could be around human trafficking. It could be around that the civil rights movement didn't end and is an ongoing process. But what we do is the students choose. What do you want to do with this information? And students are brilliant. Like if we give them an opportunity to have voice, and as an instructor, I step back, I provide parameters and say, okay, now what? And I find that students will come with amazing ideas and probably better ideas than I ever thought of.
That's great. It's so funny. I've been here at Ohio State for over 8 years now, and I didn't know about these underground railroad markers, but this is the second time I learned of them this week, right? So I didn't know anything about these until Monday, and now you're the second person that's brought them up, which is just always boggles my mind sometimes how this works. So this question came in from Twitter, and I think it's a really good one, so I'm going to skip to it here. How do we separate these discussions or the discussion of ideals and solutions? And if you all have this answer,
so I'm not sure I want to separate them, right? So the learning method that we use at the Media Lab is that you got to build something, and what this means is at least twice a year you're sort of showing off a new invention, a new robot, a new piece of hardware, a new way of growing plants, any number of different things. You're showing them to sponsors who are coming in. And then for the thesis, you're building another thing, and you're probably building several things in the course of the PhD. And the one thing you cannot get away with is not building something physical and tangible that people can play with and touch and interact with in one fashion or another. But the other thing you can't get away with is not being thoughtful about the decisions that you're making within that. And so you can come up with a solution to a problem. You can come up with a prosthetic limb, right? We have a whole lab that works on artificial limbs. And people will be blown away by how incredibly this works and the machine learning that sort of goes behind it. But you're also going to end up in a dialogue about who is this accessible to? How is this affordable? What sort of equipment do we need for someone to be fitted and to learn this? And so that prosthetic limb suddenly becomes this debate between ideals. We want someone who's missing a limb to have a limb as close as possible to human function, or maybe superhuman function, which is very much what the designer who works on this is looking for. He's actually trying to make legs for rock climbing that were better than his human legs before he lost them. But then we also have questions about ideals. How do you make prosthetics accessible to everybody? How do we build something that right now is a $250,000 appliance and build it for $50? And so for me, getting people to propose a solution and put it out there is that opportunity to talk about the ideals and to talk about how those ideals rival one another. it turns out that the ideal of a leg that functions as well or better than a human leg is in real strong conflict with a leg that is inexpensive enough that it is accessible to everybody, and leg that someone can fit someone for in Freetown, Sierra Leone. And so how you're then trading off between those three different ideals, that is the learning. And it's trying to figure out where you end up within that sweet spot.
Thank you. I think it's amazing. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the skills that you think students need to thrive in their lives outside of the institution, outside of the university. And Christian, I'd like to start with you with the student perspective and a little bit about the work you've done with Grow, right? And what are the skills that you've taken from here that you think are going to help you in that endeavor?
So really, Grow came to be through a service project, a year-long service project. And we set off, and there was a team of 7 or 8 of us, and we got paired together and said, hey, figure out something to impact the community. And lo and behold, as things kind of developed, I was elected to lead it. But for me, much of my time in school and high school, I didn't really seek out leadership positions. This was a very weighty thing, and I wanted to deliver. And so that fear of, I guess the risk of failure. I don't like using the word fear because it's just not kind of part of my life. I overcome it. But the component of failure and really having to stretch out. And for me, I became very aware of my weaknesses. I'm an integrator. I like bringing people together. I don't really like delegating and telling what people to do, or like when conflict arises, I don't want to ruffle any feathers. And so I'd had to have times when we'd have a side meeting and be just open in discussion, like, why are you having an issue with such and such? And they would actually be vulnerable, and me being willing to be vulnerable to have these discussions, because it gives the invitation for people to trust you with whatever they may have, and also be open to getting feedback and saying, hey, I'm uncertain about this, and showing, just being authentic. And at the end of it all, I realized how much it was for me to just jump in and learn how to swim rather than staying on the surface, staying on the edge of things. And from it, it's really kind of grew me in ways I've never imagined, where now I'm more confident in what I'm able to do. I'm willing to ask for help. I'm willing to step out more. And really during that whole year process, I saw myself grow and grow and grow. And I mean, inevitably it led to the nonprofit organization Grow, and I'm where it is today, but just that entire experience has been transformative.
How do, as our 2 resident Ohio State faculty members here, how do you balance this need to give students specific information, right, about a topic with creative problem solving, or some of the things that we've talked about?
I think we, as educators, really need to look at our pedagogy. We need to really be able to tear it all down and say, this is a new day. So how do I deliver content and also help students problem solve? Well, I embed content within any problem solving scenario. I embed content in situations and scenarios where students will learn the skills, the knowledge, the content that they need to know, which means I have to, I will be honest, work a little harder. It's easy. For me, it's easier for me to stand and just say, oh, you need to know this, 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 and this. Take a quiz. I have to really think. I have to be much more intentional. I have to really be willing to approach it differently, to say, now let's do this way. And be also willing to say, okay, let's see, and to step back. So
I was going to say, I think you're speaking to being okay with taking risk in the classroom. And I think it's so interesting how educators, some educators, I'm not trying to bash educators, of course, we want our students to take risk, and yet we're petrified of taking risk ourselves. So I think what you're saying here really speaks to that. I mean, something as simple, the question of ideals versus solutions, something as simple as inviting more real-world audiences into your classroom. Guest speakers, identify key learning partners. Those are very, very quick solutions that will kind of speak to that issue. So,
I came into the classroom pretty late. I was 38 by the time I was teaching full-time. I had a bunch of careers before then. And there's three things that I've ended up teaching at MIT that I didn't expect to be teaching, but I end up teaching them all the time. One is presentation. Within our lab, people present all the time. We have visitors virtually every day. My students are on a rotation, not only to present their work, but to present other people's work. And there's an enormous amount of trust in that. Someone might be coming in that might be a sponsor who's able to bring someone else's project forward. You really have to trust your brothers and sisters in the lab that they're going to present your work well. The second is writing. My students think they're going to be engineers. They don't think they're going to be writers. One of the things they have to do to get a PhD with me is be able to write about their highly technical work for general interest audiences. The general's exam in my PhD program is to write an article for the Atlantic or the New Yorker about your work. My first PhD student sold his general's exams for $350 to the Atlantic, which published it. And that is now considered sort of like the high bar of this. You want to find some way to get it out there. The third one, this is the crazy one, is how to run a meeting. We have classes on how you run a meeting, so you can do exactly what you're talking about. How do you get the best out of people? When do you want to do that confrontation when you're all at the table? When do you want to bring it over to a sidebar? How do you use people's time effectively? It's really interesting. Those skills, even more than any of the computational engineering stuff we do, those are the things that turn out to have an enormous amount to do with student success as we're sort of looking at these real-world questions.
So the Twitter questions are coming in fast and furious and taking us down some different paths. So I hope you're all okay with that, right? So I'm gonna group a couple of them together here. So Shauna, I'm not sure if this is actually a question or a statement, but I'm gonna ask it anyway because it says it's from you. Tech knowledge has increased exponentially. Social thinking seems less thoughtful than that of thinking over the past 500 years. What are your thoughts on that? Because I think it's a powerful statement.
Facebook's less than 20 years old, right? The web, as we know it, is less than 30 years old. The internet is less than 50 years old. Technology is happening really, really fast. There's a real feeling that we can't haul it back. That's not true. People decide to turn away from technologies all the time. The question is how we get out of this mindset that says that because it's new, it's desirable. And how do we get into a mindset that essentially says, this is possible, that's exciting, now let's figure out how to have a conversation about it. I share my lab with a guy named Kevin Esfeld. Kevin studies gene drives and CRISPR gene editing. His big innovation is that he has a way, he believes, to cure Lyme disease by genetically engineering mice that are immune to Lyme, releasing them in the population, having them outcompete the local population, and killing off deer tick. And he wants to do this by releasing his mutant mice on the island of Martha's Vineyard and curing Lyme disease there.
I think that was a movie, but I don't.
He's preparing to spend the next 20 years having a conversation about the ethics of this. How does a community decide if this is okay or not? That, to me, is a healthy place to go. Like, we know we can do this. We know we could try this out. How would we do this in a way where, we make it so that it's reversible, or we try to figure out what the harms are so that people actually have an educated voice and choice around this? We got to slow down, and we got to emphasize some of those other factors, not just what's new and what's possible, but what's desirable, and honestly, even more than that, how do you structure that conversation about what's desirable?
Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes left. I want to switch gears a little bit again, and this is our 10th year of Innovate, and you saw the screen this morning about where we were 10 years ago, and what are the possibilities going forward in the next 10 years. So if some of us are still here in 2029, what is it going to look like, and what are we going to be talking about? or what should we be thinking about that are going to bridge that gap from today to then? And I want to open that up to the panel and just let you guys each take a minute or two to talk about where you think we should be going in those 10 years, or what you think at the end of those 10 years this place will look like.
Well, I think we can't, in 10 years, we can't talk about real-world application and real-world education without talking about diversity education. I think that's at the foundation of it. Being able to develop certain cultural competencies so that if you are of a privileged group, you can advocate for marginalized communities and be an effective ally. I think those type of conversations are going to be even more imperative in 10 years. And I think one of the biggest benefits of having a quote-unquote diverse education is being able to critically examine your own education. And what I mean by that is, I had a student, about 5 years ago. I was teaching public speaking, and for those who are very familiar with public speaking, we go back to the Western thought, meaning we talk about Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato, and the persuasive appeals, logos, ethos, and pathos. So I'm lecturing, yada, yada, yada. And the student, she raises her hand. She was like, oh, that's great, but why are we not talking about the African griots, who were amazing public speakers in their own right? I was like, you're right? So I think that type of stuff is going to become more commonplace, and I think that's going to be more of a foundational conversation as opposed to an afterthought, diverse education.
Tammy, what are your thoughts?
Since I work with pre-service teachers, I look a lot at K-12 education, which is slow to change sometimes. My hope is that in 10 years, we'll be having fewer conversations on college campuses with pre-service teachers about the tension between what we want to do at the university and what is real in K-12 education, and that we'll see a greater alignment, which would really open up the education that we can do on our college campuses, I think. I do also think this is a difficult time, and the conversations around ethics, around diversity, equity, will need to continue to increase. And those difficult conversations of what is the value of this for all people and not a specific subset, I think hopefully will be at the forefront of conversations rather than what I feel now is a little bit of an afterthought.
Yeah, I mean, I did have something, but it kind of was passing. But really, it was, when I look at the role of technology, I think it's quite fascinating how it can enhance education in so many variety of ways. And I had the opportunity to see some technology when I was visiting in California that really had brought a virtual classroom where a professor could appear on a wall, like a projector across the wall. And we would sit in the room with cameras, and you could raise your hand, and he'd engage with you and teach you. And what this really reveals to me is that you could actually provide the education and classroom experience all across the world by just having a room set up for these kids. And in this example, it was a guy in a rural town where they were actually working on projects with different colleges and institutions, high school students, and being able to have these wonderful experiences through the role of technology. And I feel like these type of innovations can be really embedded into schools and institutions in the next 10 years. And another thing that I've noticed that is really important is when in the discipline, we're very focused on specialization of courses. But the reality is, in the world, we're working on teams, we're working together with people with all different walks of life and expertise. And really integrating the different colleges and different fields together on projects and working experiences is something that I think we recognize and ties into the diversity and inclusion of having variety and people of different backgrounds working together that will just completely transform the educational experience.
So where I hope we are in 10 years is that different people are inventing the future. So let me give you two examples of this. Y'all may have noticed that phones got real small for a while, then they started getting really, really big. And people started having these phones that were like huge, really big. They're almost more like tablets. And then there was kind of a backlash to this because it turned out that a lot of people, particularly women, weren't comfortable holding a phone that was like 2 pounds and like required you to stretch your hand like this. Well, who is designing the phones? Dudes. Dudes with big hands. Who was not being tested on these phones? Women who had smaller hands. And so you suddenly had these market failures of people coming out and people essentially saying, I don't want this device. Here's another one. I mentioned my student Joy Bolam-Winnie, who's doing all this work on AI, facial identification, discrimination. Joy is Ghanaian American. She's quite dark-skinned. She ended up getting into this field because she was trying to design a device that would let you look in a mirror and overlay video footage of an inspiring figure. In her case, it was Serena Williams, with your face. And to do this, the mirror had to see where your face was. And the algorithms couldn't see her. They wouldn't lock onto her face. They'd lock onto mine just fine. Eventually, she found herself programming this interface by taking a white, featureless, like dramatis personae mask, putting it on, and then the system would see her. Who built that system? Not Ghanaians, not dark-skinned people. And it was trained mostly on pale males. And as a result, it did not do well with darker-skinned females. Right now, we've gotten used to this notion that there's a group of people who look a lot like I did 20 years ago who get to invent the future. And they're in San Francisco, and they work for startups, and they play foosball, and they drink expensive coffee drinks, and they have weird glasses. And that's where innovation comes from. You know what? That's bullshit. Because innovation comes from all sorts of different places. But we have to change that paradigm about who gets to invent futures. And for me, and for educators in general, I think that question, who do we allow to invent the future, and how do we let them in, and how do we support them, is probably the biggest challenge that we have over the next 10 years.
Thank you all for your insights. And in your program, it mentioned that the provost, McPherson, would be here. He couldn't be here. Something came up in the last minute. We were in a meeting the other day. I'm going to speak for him, and he could yell at me later if I say something incorrectly. We were talking about some of the major changes we're going through here at the university, and he made everyone in the room say these 4 words: change is good, change is okay. And that's leading from a different place than we've led from in a lot of times at the university. So I promised to him that I would say that today. I won't make you say it. You can if you'd like to. But I know if he was sitting here, he'd say he wants to lead this university from a place of trust, a place of values, and a place that accepts change. And you all bring that here. So Jasmine, I think this is the second year we did a panel in a row, right? So this is our thing now. So we're going to do this every year, right? So thank you for all you do. And Tammy, thank you for all you do here at Ohio State. Ethan, thank you for teaching the engineers of MIT some humanities. I didn't even know that existed there, so that's great. Because we've all seen that movie, and it doesn't end well. And Christian, good luck and congratulations in your future endeavors. Let's have a big round of applause for our panelists. And enjoy the rest of your day at Innovate. So thank you all for coming.